Rigtig hjertelig velkommen til Det Kgl. Bibliotek. Jeg hedder Lise Vagh Hansen, og min kollega og jeg er rigtig glade for at se jer her på denne dejlige forårsaften. Jeg vil også byde velkommen til vores studerende fra Students Only-netværket, og rigtig hjertelig velkommen til jer fra vores erhvervsforum, Det Kgl. Biblioteks erhvervsforum. Ambitionen med det forum er, at vi samles her og møder nogle af de mest interessante internationale meningsdannere, der diskuterer lederskab og diskuterer nogle af de store dagsordner, blandt andet bæredygtighed og klima, som vi også skal snakke om i aften, i forhold til lederskab og udvikling af organisationer. Så rigtig hjertelig velkommen til jer. I er jo nogle af de aktuelle beslutningstagere og ledere, der kan være med til at sætte dagsordenen, og det er de studerende også, så vi håber virkelig, at den her talerække med tænkere, der taler om klima kan have rigtig god indflydelse, og også rundt i virksomhederne og også rundt i bestyrelseslokalerne. Det er derfor en virkelig stor ære for mig i aften, at vi skal møde John Elkington. Han har skrevet en række bøger, deriblandt bestsellerne Green Consumer Guide Series. Han har siddet i en række store internationale bestyrelser. Han er desuden professor og underviser på 3 britiske universiteter i England. Og igennem en lang karriere, der har Elkington kredset om et helt centralt emne. Og det er nemlig, hvordan vi kan forme et økonomisk system, der også kan skabe vækst på en ansvarlig og bæredygtig måde. Og i aften, der skal det blandt andet handle om hans seneste bog, der hedder Green Swans. Og det er også en bog, der har startet en masse diskussioner i England, også internationalt, og lige præcis hos en masse ledere. Jeg håber, at I også bliver inspireret i aften. Og vi har spurgt Mette Østergaard om at tale med ham her på scenen lige om et øjeblik. Hun har siden 2018 været chefredaktør på Berlingske Tidende. Hun har været politisk redaktør og redaktionschef på Politikken, hvorefter hun blev chefredaktør og kanalchef på TV2 News. Til sidst der skal jeg lige rette en stor og varm tak til vores samarbejdspartner og vores sponsor, nemlig fagforeningen DM og A-kassen MA, som gør det muligt for os at lave nogle af de her arrangementer, også at få vores Students Only-netværk med herind til en rigtig god pris. Tilbage er der bare at sige, tag rigtig godt imod John Elkington og Mette Østergaard. Tak.
Welcome, John.
Thanks, mate.
Elkington. It's I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you. It's a pleasure meeting you, an honor. How is it to visit Denmark on such a beautiful spring night?
I don't want to go back. Simple answer.
Yeah. When I look into your book, Green Swans, that we're going to talk about, and also other interviews you've done, it seems like you had a bit of a love affair with this country. Is that true?
I first came to Denmark in 1969. The young woman who became my wife, had a Swedish boyfriend before, so we hitchhiked up to Stockholm to see him, and then we hitchhiked back. And we slept in a bus shelter on the outskirts of Copenhagen that first time. But there was a wonderful man who picked us up from, he was going to a steel mill, and he was going to sign a big contract that day. And he got us into his car, and we were driving where he was going to drop us off. And he suddenly said, no, during the war, your country played an important role, and I'm going to take you to the coast now, I'm going to take you to the harbour, but can I stop off and make a telephone call and tell the steel mill I'm going to come later? I just thought that was just, what an introduction to a country. And then later in the late 1980s, I started coming, particularly to work with Novo Nordisk. But that's another story.
But I can read in the book that you praise Novo Nordisk on being one of the first big companies, large companies, to really turn itself around the triple bottom line. I can also read that you work together with Copenhagen Business School. I don't know if there's some students from there tonight.
Wonderful.
Yeah, there is.
Good evening.
But most importantly, Wikipedia at some point made up that you had a Danish wife you didn't even know nothing about.
It may have been a reality, I don't know, but I didn't know about her until that point.
Yeah.
I very rarely looked at Wikipedia, and the first time I ever did, I saw that fact.
Yeah, well, nice surprise.
Yeah.
But
I should be proud.
Yeah, you refer to Hans Christian Andersen, and you do that because you also describe the pre-stage of the green swans, or the black, or the gray, or the blue, the ugly ducklings. I would like to start out with asking you, why did you feel the urge to change the black swan into a green swan phenomena?
Well, I love books. I mean, I think you do too, and what a wonderful place to be talking about books. And every so often one comes along that just has a transformative effect on the way that any one of us thinks about the world. And when Nassim Nicholas Taleb wrote The Black Swan, and that was published in 2007, just ahead of the financial crash, I mean, everyone thought he was a prophet, and as you know, what he was saying, that every so often, out of the blue, comes something that is completely unexpected. And I love that book. I love the idea of the black swan. But I wondered whether there would be a special class of black swans, because he covered problems and challenges, and he also covered solutions. But whether there was a special class that would be exponential solutions to things like climate change, but also to some of the other challenges that the Sustainable Development Goals flag up. So I also like playing with metaphors, and it seemed to be a nice one at the time.
Could you just take out the most important characteristic for a green swan?
Well, for me it is in part that they are an exponential trajectory. And since the book came out, from different parts of the world, people have been sending me copies or photographs, or actually examples of their business cards, in which they say, no, I work in the Philippines or Indonesia, and I'm a green swan. That really wasn't the idea. I mean, I like it. I mean, it's wonderful, and I know more power to them. But the idea was that these were technological, market, political, cultural trends with the potential, after a period of growing relatively slowly, to suddenly go through an inflection point and take us somewhere quite unexpected. And the problem is things like COVID-19 take us places we really don't want to go at an exponential rate. So the key characteristic is that these things at least have the potential to go viral in a good way, to sort of scale and replicate, to use the sort of Silicon Valley language.
You've mentioned the internet, the cell phone technology, but also the vaccine technology, which some of it actually came out of COVID.
Well, it's interesting because if somebody had said in the 1950s or 60s we would all be walking around in our pockets with what we now call a cell phone, but would then have been a super computer linked to this thing, the internet. I mean, there were a few science fiction authors talking about that sort of future, but it just was beyond our imagination. And the idea of the green swan is that already in our world there are people working on solutions to some of the absolutely critical, existential challenges that we face as a species. And at least some of those, with the right following wind and support and the rest of it, could take us again to good places that we didn't expect to be. So it's fundamentally an optimistic and I hope hopeful line of argument.
So you wrote Green Swans. What was the urge? Why did you want to read exactly that book? Because you wrote about 20 books. So why was there a need for especially this book?
Well, let me start personally, and then I'll talk about the need. Because when I was a child, I watched a chicken being cut open, and I've been a vegetarian for 45 years.
Did you wish?
I watched the chicken, and you may all know, but that a chicken, it's true with girls and women too, that all of the eggs that they will ever lay is in their body already when they're very, very young indeed. And I feel the same with books. I feel that if anyone had told me when I was a child I would write even one book, I'd have thought absolutely screaming nonsense. It cannot happen. I didn't come from a family where that was done. But I have that sort of compulsion to write. And I often say that if I want to learn about something, I write a book, because it's a good excuse to go
and you do a reflection as you write. Yeah.
And I hadn't written a book for a few years, and that one started to bubble up because I'd been to places like Silicon Valley and other places, Los Angeles and so on, to talk to some of the people working on exponential technology. And although some of them are absolute nutcases, some of them are, even some of the nutcases
Tell us some examples of that.
Well, I once worked at the World Economic Forum with Larry Page of Google, and it's a different species, really. But they do things which periodically
they move humankind ahead as well.
They do. Elon Musk, another example.
Yeah.
And so the idea started to form, and the idea of the ugly duckling came as part of that, because I thought most green swan trajectories and so on they're not born full-fledged. I mean, they evolve over time. And very often, to start with, they look really peculiar. I mean, they really do. And
so how do you see the potential?
Well, when I was saying, things look peculiar, I was remembering last night being in the boardroom at Ford in Dearborn, outside Michigan, in the early part of this century, and talking to people like Bill Ford and others about Elon Musk, because it was 2003, 2004, he was just setting up Tesla. And I said, that's really interesting. And the answer I got was, we tried electric vehicles 100 years ago, it didn't work, and it's not going to work again. And now I'm not claiming to be any sort of prophet or whatever, but every so often you see something that looks so seriously strange that it's worth paying attention to. And I like to be on the edges of any system. I like to talk to the people who aren't currently in the mainstream. So it used to be environmental activists. It used to be human rights people. It then went to social entrepreneurs, social innovators, then exponential thinkers. Now it's people working on regenerative farming and so on. And part of the story is to try and understand what they're doing, understand what they're doing that might actually become more mainstream over time, and then just giving that a little bit more of a push.
So look outside the mainstream.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. We talk about this technology, and not because of the technology, but because it should help us solve the climate change and the climate chaos. We just had another dreadful UN report coming out about a month ago, and once again we know that from science that the clock is really ticking, and we don't know if we can actually reach the 1.5 degree. It seems harder and harder. Are we getting past the tipping point, or what are the what are the possibilities that we can actually reverse this? We know all the facts. We have all the science. And we work on technology. but still it seems like we don't work hard enough. Why is it so difficult for us to act?
I wish I had a simple answer to the question, but I think as a species, when faced with something that is right in front of us, a bull or a motorbike or whatever it is coming at us very fast and very hard, we'll act. Our reflexes trip in and we become active or we're dead. So it's a natural selection pressure. But with these very big systemic crises, it's much harder, firstly, to see them, because very often it's scientists who see them first. And then the question is, do we trust the science? And very often what you find is public relations agencies like Burson Marsteller and so on start to sort of throw up dust clouds to sort of mask what's going on, because they're paid to do that by the tobacco industry or the lead and gasoline industry or now the fossil fuels sectors. So I think there are people who actively try and ensure that we don't see what's going on. But I also think as a species, we're a herd animal, and we tend to leave things routinely too late, and then we stampede.
We know it's very difficult to change habits.
It is, and what I've just said, I mean, will sound very pessimistic. I also think to that tipping point, I read these UN reports, and I go and visit some of the scientists who work on these sorts of issues. And about 20 years ago, in fact, exactly 20 years ago, I went to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on Cape Cod, and the director took my wife and I around for just a full day. And we met all of the leading climate scientists. And I thought I knew about climate science then. And I came out literally, we would say, with my knees knocking, because the scale of what they were already seeing then, 20 years ago, with the deep currents starting to shift, it was terrifying. And they were saying, you know, if this continues, within about 40 to 50 years, we're going to be in Western Europe, back to where Siberia was. And so the question you've just asked me, Mette, I constantly ask myself, why is it that even if the science is there, we cannot take it on board? Because is it psychological? Is it emotional? Is it just a belief that nothing like that can possibly happen? But just to go optimistic in a way, I think that as a species we tend to leave things way too late, but then we act. In very short order, we start to do things. And it's often too late, and now I think in some senses it's certainly too late to stay under 1.5 degrees. I mean, as the UN says, you know, we'll be there in just a few years. The question is whether that's a terrible thing, and I think it will be, but whether it has good aspects, whether it will so terrify people that you'll then finally start to get people acting. But I think we'll still see those problem industries lobbying extremely hard, either publicly or very often behind the scenes. And somehow we've got to address that problem.
The German Vice Chancellor, Robert Habeck, was on this stage about a month ago, and he said that we do not need change to protect the climate. We need change to protect humanity.
Yeah.
Do you agree on that?
One of the people who had, I think, a huge influence on my thinking, I first came across in 1975. I gave up science when I was 14. I refused to cut up frogs, so I was told I couldn't do biology. And if I couldn't do biology, I couldn't do chemistry and I couldn't do physics. Bless you. But I then had one of these moments where
so the frogs really did it for you. You can handle the climate change, but the frogs
it was a benefit, because I came into science writing, and not being a scientist helped. But one of the magazines I started to write for, New Scientist, published in 1975 an article by somebody called James Lovelock about the Gaia hypothesis. It was one of those moments where you just saw an argument, an explanation for where we are as a species, which spoke to me incredibly powerfully. And later on I got to know him before he died. And to your question, I think I think science is changing quite fundamentally, and people are beginning to see the systemic aspects of our interrelationship with the planet, and to the point that this is about saving humanity, not about saving the climate. That's what Lovelock said for about 40 years. So I think it's correct, but it is also about saving the climate, because as the climate changes, every other species on Earth pretty much is going to be advantaged or disadvantaged. So the repercussions of biodiversity are going to be huge.
So even though you have looked into the science, you've looked into the facts for so many years, you're still optimistic. Why is that?
Because I was born that way. I mean, in the sense that you can't do, I mean, there are people in the audience who will come from activist groups, Greenpeace and people like that. I mean, how have people like that continued to hammer away over so many decades? And sometimes it's the organization, not the individuals. But I'm optimistic in the sense that I believe in progress. And I also believe that we're not entirely stupid as a species. I think that...
But is it too late? That's the big question all the time. Is it too late to be optimistic?
For many things it is too late. And if you look back at the history of our species, we have a criminal record of crashing ecosystems and then moving on. It's sort of what we do. We've got this last chance to sort of try and overcome, in a sense, that criminal record. I still believe we can. I still believe that some trends are moving very much in our favor.
But you must be optimistic also because you've seen examples on how business worked with this, how they actually develop new technologies that can help us and so on.
Yeah.
Where do you see the coming green swans? Where should we look for them?
One of the groups that I've really admired for a very long time is called Rethink X, and they're based in Silicon Valley and in the UK. And some people in the audience will have heard of them, and if you haven't, I really do recommend their work. And the first study that they did was on transportation and mobility. And they talked about a future into the 2030s where there's a huge transformation in the automobile industry in particular, with electrification and so on. But one of the arguments they made is you're going to see a 50% increase in the kilometers traveled by humanity over the next sort of few decades. But you're going to see something like a 60% collapse in the revenues going to the oil companies, going to the automotive companies, and so on. So they're looking structurally at what's going to happen. So you're absolutely right in the sense that there are now trends, and they've looked at cattle ranching and dairying, they've looked at energy, and they've looked at finance and so on. And in every one of these sectors, you see these trends building. The issue is that the social shockwaves that will come from these disruptive changes in our economies need hugely intelligent, long-term political planning to make sure that people are reskilled and moved between sectors and so on. And largely we're not doing that yet. And we're particularly not doing it in countries like the United States. So the social shock waves, almost the future shock, as Alvin Toffler would call it, or have called it, is going to be profound.
Yes, because a lot of the examples we've talked about when green swans, how to change the climate, is around technology.
Yes.
But you're also saying maybe we can find change elsewhere. Could we look for huge change in how we deal with the climate change in other sectors than technology?
Well, I think, firstly, we've forced ourselves into a corner now where we have no option but to do carbon capture, and we have no option but to do things that are called geoengineering, where you start to put compounds into the oceans to sort of pull carbon out of the atmosphere and so on. But I actually think that there will be a cultural response to this at some point. People, particularly younger people, as you know, are increasingly talking about degrowth and how do we just step off the treadmill of just constantly growing our GNP and so on. I think it's a very intriguing idea. I think it's a very dangerous one too, because if you stopped our economies dead now, the social repercussions of that would be profound. So a lot of this depends on really intelligent politicians, and you've had one on the stage just very recently, but most politicians, with the greatest respect, even if they start that way, they don't end up that way because the game that they're forced to play is just a different one.
Yeah. We'll talk more about the political systems, I promise. I'm just trying to spot if there could be a new generations of solutions out there in areas where we haven't really looked the past decades.
Well, I think, you look at the Industrial Revolution. Why did that happen? Well, one of the reasons was that my own country ran out of timber because we'd been cutting down all the trees to build ships to sort of take over the world. And we ran out of fuel that way, so we discovered coal, and all of that happened. And now we're in a very similar situation where all sorts of things are going to become scarcer. So, there's this mad scramble, this gold rush for lithium and all sorts of rare earth metals and so on. That will drive innovation, and sort of batteries in the future will be built out of materials we can scarcely even begin to imagine today. So is that going to happen in the next 5 to 7 years? I don't think so. Is it going to happen in your lifetime? It's almost guaranteed. The question is, does that happen fast enough? Is it deployed in an inclusive way where people aren't disadvantaged unnecessarily by that? And does it happen around the world? Does it just happen in the global north or parts of the global north? How do we actually make sure that it happens right around the world?
It seems sometimes that we're looking for miracles, but in a in a very in a way that we really want to get this done if we have to survive. I know there's quite a lot of business leaders in the audience as well, and I know you advise many business leaders and boards. What is your advice to them at the moment on how they should look for these miracles?
Well, just to explain, I grew up in parts of the world where religion was a real problem. So I very early on, like Northern Ireland and Israel and so on. And so for me, religion is a bit of a problem, and miracles go along with that. But there are people, Charles Eisenstein among them, who talk about miracles as being those moments where you step from one reality to another, where something that seemed absolutely impossible suddenly becomes possible and then inevitable. And I think that form of sort of secular miracle is not only possible, but it is increasingly happening. And I think the reason I started to work with business over 40 years ago, at the time when groups like Greenpeace basically told me, if that's what you want to do, that's fine, but the only way to deal with business is to strap them down with lots of ropes and so on, and just make sure that they can't move. And my response was, well, I can see why you might think that, but if you're going to get these people's creative juices running and so on, you're going to have to give them a bit of freedom and to experiment and so on.
What were they afraid of? Why should they tie the businesses all down?
Because at that time, many industries were, looking back now, virtually criminal, in the sense that they were doing things that the future would see as absolutely obscene. And there were companies I worked with. For example, there's a company that no longer exists called ICI. And I worked with their CEO, I worked with their chairman back in the 80s. And this was during the build-up to the chlorofluorocarbon issue, or you could call it a scandal. And they were doing science, they were paying for science that showed there wasn't a problem up there. And then some scientists in Antarctica just put up old-fashioned balloons and found that there was a huge problem. And just then seeing that company, just in this, they weren't trying to be criminal, but their business models and their sort of almost ideology locked them into a world where it was fine to take from the environment.
Was that because it was the single bottom line, that it was the profit that was really controlling the decisions?
I think it was the way that we'd always operated as a species, and particularly as an international species. When people were forced to live in specific areas, places, regions, whatever, they were also forced to conserve natural resources and understand them to a degree when you were traveling around the world and bringing back the world's resources. You didn't have to think about that for a long time. And that was this was the 70s, 80s, 90s. That sort of limits to growth reality although it was contested at the time, was just beginning to come home.
And that was when you created a triple bottom line.
Well, that was 1994, yes.
Which is people and planet and profit.
Yeah.
And why did you feel the need to create that triple bottom line at that time?
Well, in 1987, we'd set up a small company called Sustainability, and at that time, the word wasn't used. I mean, universities have done word searches since, and they just haven't found it. But I was trying to sell the notion of sustainability, sustainable development, which the Brundtland Report had talked about, sustainable development, to business. And I thought, well, what does business think about? And often it is that profitability, the financial bottom line. And it may seem absurd, but it took me 18 months to get from the recognition that something was needed to those three words. And at the time, I had this, when I came up finally with the triple bottom line phrase, I thought, I've heard this before. Somebody's talked about this before. And I rang all sorts of people, and I got in touch to see who recognized it. No one did.
You could actually claim it.
Well, I thought I could. But then many years later, I mentioned Future Shock and Alvin Toffler. Later on, he wrote a book called The Third Wave. And that was, I think, published in 1980. And I read it about that time. And I reread it, and on page, 236, there was a subheading which said, multiple bottom lines.
Multiple.
And I thought, that was it. That was the seed. And there's nothing really new under the sun, but language is important. And if you can come up with a concept that is, at least has people asking questions, what the hell is that? It can be progress.
I think today we are working with multiple definitions of that theme. Businesses work with CSR or ESG or other parameters where they look at the economy, the social aspects, and so on. So in some way, it's totally integrated in how businesses would look at the bottom line today. Do you agree on that?
Do I have to agree? I mean, in the sense that, no, I'm not sure that's totally true, in the sense that we're currently in a Tower of Babel situation where everyone wants to have their language. They all want to have their branding. They all want to have their jargon.
You think it's more branding than actually action?
Often. Yes, I do. And you've seen this mad feeding frenzy around ESG. And, the triple bottom line did lead to things like the double bottom line and all these different things, ESG and all the rest of it. And I'm, at some level, I'm happy that happened, but I'm unhappy when I see these feeding frenzies develop where everyone is using language without necessarily understanding what the terms ought to mean. Mm-hmm. And with the ESG sector in particular, you've recently seen the European Commission starting to strip the ESG labels off funds sort of holding and managing hundreds of millions, even trillions of dollars. And I think that's necessary. It's sad that we have to have that overreaction and then the pullback. But that's
you
human
reacted
nature.
to that tendency as well about the triple bottom line. You recalled it in
Yes.
in '98, and you've said it was because everybody had their own interpretation of it, and you didn't really find that everybody actually understood what was the purpose of it. Is that what's happening also at the moment with ESG, for example?
I think so. I think the specific reason, and some people assume that I'm logical. Some people assume that I might know what I'm doing. But very often, it's intuitive, it's instinctive. So with the recall, I'd worked with companies like Ford and Toyota and Volvo and so on. And I'd seen them go through product recalls where you have a perfectly good product, but there are dysfunctions. So you pull it back and then you fix them and you put it back on the road or whatever the product's meant to do. And I thought, well, it wasn't that there were lots of different interpretations so much of the triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit. It was more that people were using it as an excuse, an alibi, to trade off between, to give you a very, very basic example, you might have a company that would say, economic side, well, we make a profit, so that's that tick. Well, the idea of the economic dimension of the triple bottom line was companies and industries have a much broader economic impact than is taken into account the normal financial bottom line. And then might say, well, on the social side, well, we employ people, we give consumers what they want. So that's a social take. It's a shame about the environment, or it could work other ways. Sure. But it was just the sense that as the B Corporation movement spread around the world, there was a very real risk that as it mainstreamed, the concept would be diluted out of sight. And some people saw a product recall as just the end of story. The idea goes on the spike. That wasn't the idea at all.
But I guess a lot of companies will still find it difficult on how they merge these different bottom lines. That because I guess that's your idea. You have to think it all together before it really works in the right way, how you thought of it, instead of just ticking some boxes and said we did some of this and some of that. So what are the good advice if you a company leader and you actually truly want to work with this, but you find it difficult to really get these different bottom lines to merge?
Well, I think for well-established companies, it can be very difficult indeed, particularly if they're driven by today's financial markets and influenced by sort of Milton Friedman's, the only business of business is to make a profit style thinking. The sorts of companies and businesses that I see that do naturally embrace the triple bottom line are quite often family-owned businesses. I mean, I'm talking to a company in Brazil today, Gerdau, big steel company, family-owned, and they were talking about what I understand to be the triple bottom line in a way that this is. I'm always nervous when people say this is part of our DNA, because I think it's easy to use language, but it's not often the reality. But I think family-owned businesses are very often there. I think the cooperative movement had a very strong element of this. So you can see in the historical economy examples of people who embraced the triple bottom line. The challenge is that for big companies, if you've got to integrate this and you've got problems on some parts of the accounting or calculus or whatever, it can be quite difficult to move to a more integrated solution. Well, which is why I'm terribly excited about the B corporations, many of which are set up specifically to pursue a triple bottom line agenda. Now, over 6,000 of those around the world. But 6,000 sounds in one sense a big number, but in the context of the tens of millions of businesses around the world, we'd not even gotten started.
But you praised Novo Nordisk for actually being one of the big companies who was able to do that. What was it you saw that they did right?
Well, one of the things they did was extremely unusual at the time. And at the time, we'd just done this book, The Green Consumer Guide. It was a massive threat to companies like Novo Nordisk. They suddenly found some of their big customers. They then produced industrial enzymes and so on, which went into detergent products and so on. So they started to find companies like Lever and Procter & Gamble and so on, starting to ask very difficult questions. Most companies at that time treated us as you'd expect them to. McDonald's sued us for 5 months. 3 different parts of ICI sued us. Even when I was working with their chairman, 3 different businesses were suing us, none of them knowing each other was doing it.
What were they suing you about?
Because we said things that they didn't like about their products. And we won every one of the cases, as it happens. But it was a period where people were... They still thought that they could bully their way to an outcome that they were comfortable with. But with Novo Nordisk, that was the normality. And what Mads Olesen did, who was then the CEO, he sent 2 people to a conference I was speaking at in London. And they came up to me afterwards and they said, "Will you come to Bausweiler and see our CEO?" I said, I'd love to. I mean, I like visiting companies. I like biotechnology and so on. And I went there with my young colleague, Julia Hales, who I'd co-written the book with. And she was, I think, we set up sustainability together. She was, I think, 22 at the time, so completely unexperienced at this level, but had this brilliant brain for asking difficult questions in a friendly way. So anyway, we went to see Mats, and he said, you can go anywhere in this company you want, you can talk to anyone you want to, you can ask them anything you like, come back and tell me what you found. And we did that. We went back to London and then we came again. I think we talked to about 30 people there. And at the end of it, we came back and said, there are 3 things we think you should do. And they did them all. And we thought they were going to be a real stretch. And then after that, we probably worked with the company for about 20 years off and on.
Can you tell us the 3 things? Can you tell us the 3 things that they had to do?
Well, one of them was invite the outside world in, because at that time, companies would read in the paper about what campaigning groups were saying. And we'd say, well, why don't you invite them in and talk to them? Because at that stage, they wouldn't even think of doing that. So we suggested a process where, and it turned out to be an annual event, where we would invite 12 or 14 troublemakers. I mean, people who didn't like biotechnology, didn't like genetic engineering, and so on. And we put them in front of senior management at the company.
They have to find out the good arguments then. That's good.
Well, one of the things that the companies then, and now it's become more typical to do that, stakeholder engagement and all the rest of it. Then it was not done. But one of the things that the company people found most interesting was to listen to the stakeholders talking among themselves about trading off between their own issues and their own perspectives of different parts of this. What, from a business point of view, looked like a coherent agenda was, very much multifaceted. So that's how that started. But then something absolutely terrible happened. I mean, if you wanted to script what could go wrong in the worst possible way, it happened. The second year, we did this strange thing of getting not the company, Novo Nordisk, to invite the stakeholders in. We got the people who came the first year, none of whom came back, to ask the people for the second year.
Oh.
And so it was, peer to peer. First evening, I remember being in the hotel in Copenhagen, and everyone was watching this television news program. Number 1 story was an accidental release of genetically modified organisms from a Novo Nordisk plant in the heart of Copenhagen. You could not have scripted something that would have been more just appalling. And for a moment, it looked as though the whole thing would boil over, people were going to go home, and so on. And then somebody said, let's go in and listen to what they have to say. And the next morning, there were 70 people from Novo Nordisk, and somebody stood up on I won't say who he was, but he was an engineer and he was a lawyer, and it's a terrible combination sometimes. And he got up on the stage and he said something, I'm dramatizing, but don't worry your pretty little heads, this sort of thing happens all the time.
Oh, okay.
There was this moment, and I had to decide in an instant what to do. And his CEO was in front of him, board members were in front of him. I walked onto the stage and I steered him off the stage without saying anything. And I just said to a younger woman in the front row, Lisa Kingo, very, very young, on the margins of the company then, Lisa, come up and take over. And she did. And she did it brilliantly well. But I often say I'm not political, but there are politics that go with stakeholder engagement. And if I hadn't done that, I don't know what the outcome would have been, but it wouldn't have been good. That person never forgave me, but it was a price well worth paying.
Yeah. But to listen to your critics, that's actually a very good takeaway. Yeah. On how you should push forward your company. Is there other, you don't have to take us through all 3, you can do that, but is there takeaways that you often say to companies, okay, you have this well-established company, it's difficult for you to turn the whole business around and new bottom lines. So how do you see the potential, or how do you rephrase how how you also explain the purpose of this company, both to your employers and customers.
Well, the third thing that we suggested to Mats that they do, and it's something that was not, only 2 companies in the world had done it at the time, was produce an annual environmental, later sustainability report. Companies just didn't want to share that information, and we also said, and when you do it, have the data verified, which again, was quite a process. But we did it for several reasons. One is we felt the information was needed in the wider world, but we thought that the very process of going through that reporting exercise would force a company like Novo Nordisk to think about some of the stuff even more deeply than they perhaps had done to that date, because it was going public. And at that stage, it's not true now in the same way, but the board or the CEO had to sign off on the report because this was a big deal. So as I say, they took on board these different things, and then they launched one of the very first triple bottom line reports, and things just went from there.
Do you see a lot of greenwashing today?
It's always there, and I've always felt that greenwashing is not necessarily a bad thing, in the sense that people, again, we're a herd animal. Everything is exciting, and suddenly we want to be part of it as well. And if everyone is talking green, then we want to talk green too. And I always say that if a company or particularly, or a brand makes a mistake, an honest mistake, and then reverses it in short order, that's fine. That we all learn in that slightly messy way. But if it repeats, then you hit them very hard. So now we're seeing impact washing, ESG washing, all of these different games being played, and there are a lot of public relations agencies, playing into that space too. I think it's deadly because it undermines confidence of the ordinary citizen in what's being said. So again, I think we have to act quite quickly to stop that wherever we can.
Yeah, and the credibility disappears if it's out there in the open. But do companies do a lot of greenwashing because the consumers actually want a more green company, economical aware company and goods? You wrote a bestseller about the green consumer. So do you see a strong trend in that as well today, that the consumer can actually turn around companies on how they look at these different aspects of the bottom line?
I think to start with, a lot of greenwashing was done in the hope that this new breed of green consumers would sort of go away quite quickly. And consumer action and concern can often only be sustained for a few years. But it didn't totally go away. And so the greenwashing was not totally effective, but it wasn't helpful. And another thing wasn't helpful, which is that people took actions. They avoided certain products or whatever it was, or they picked greener brands. But no one then told them what had happened as a result of what they'd done. Supermarkets had no interest in feeding back to them. Governments weren't. They did eco-labeling, but they really didn't want to do that at any great scale. And now what you've got is just that the washing is being done with the greatest sophistication. And therefore, it's sometimes harder to challenge. But again, I do think it's really important that we do pick out the worst cases. And I think people like the European Commission are trying to do that. And I think that's healthy. But I just think it's...
So other customers or other companies could get it out in the open. Do you think that we could rely on customers to push a green agenda still?
No. By which I mean, most of us have busy lives, and
there's a moment of silence there. Everybody was afraid. They thought, okay, we could actually still have empowerment in our ways of going to the supermarket or where else. But you don't think that there's that huge an impact, or?
I think consumer action and shareholder action and these sorts of things done well can have an immense impact. as long as there are enough people doing it and as long as they sustain the pressure. Because it's like being a member of the European Parliament or member of Parliament in any country. If you still get letters or emails, a few emails or a few letters are a signal that there's a broader area of concern. So green consumers or ethical consumers or whatever they're called, concerned consumers or conscious consumers or whatever, and that's part of the problem because you get these multiple iterations. But they can have the bit like shock troops. They can shock businesses into acting because if it starts to affect a business brand and its sort of market reputation, that can be quite a mobilizing influence. The reason why I say no is because what very often happens, and it certainly happened with the Green Consumer Guide, where in very short order, in some cases within a few months, the impact of the book, which was surfing a wave of activism, was so great that many of the things we talked about in the book had changed. People had taken particular problem chemicals out of their processes or products or whatever. So it can work. But again, people, I'm the same. I do not want to think every time I buy something, where does this come from? Take my cell phone, scan the QR code, go down and look at all the provenance.
There's a political system before that has to have acted as well.
Well, actually, you want gatekeepers. You want people who will do that work for you, who you trust. So if you buy in supermarkets, you want the supermarkets to do that. So the target often has to then be the supermarkets to sort of try and get them to act.
Yeah. I think it's clear that when we talk about this, that it's a whole other field in doing business in that it was maybe 20 or 30 years ago, both on how the consumers, the politicians, the technology works. And of course, we have both some students, we have some business leaders in here. What could you tell us about what are the best criteria for being a great leader in this area now and in the future?
To be born that way, I think, initially, when you have an area like this, the people who are the pioneers, people like Anita Roddick at the Body Shop, Ben & Jerry, Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia, this is who they are. This is what they want to be in life. But over time...
Can you teach yourself? I think that's probably the question that some people ask them.
Well, I think you can. And I think if you once switch on... And I've come across quite a number of companies of CEOs and senior leaders in business who suddenly have a moment where something changes. And the most dramatic case probably was Ray Anderson at Interface, who would often say he read Paul Hawkins' book, The Ecology of Commerce, in which Paul talks about, in the future, CEOs today will be seen as criminals because they're destroying the environment and the rest of it. And Ray described that as a spear in the chest. It was a moment where he decided he had to think differently and act differently and began to. Most people don't have that moment where everything changes for them. And one of the things I think is happening now, but very late in the day, is I've taught at business schools for something like 30 years. And when I first started doing it, it was only because the students themselves wanted it, or one strange faculty member was trying to do. Even in schools like INSEAD or IMD, it was always one mutant faculty member who saw something here that was worth doing. Now you have, for example, the Financial Times doing its ranking of business schools. Sustainability is coming up. The notion that this is now something absolutely core to what business leaders should be learning is, I think, it's late, but it's exciting that it's happening. And then it's not so dependent on somebody being born that way or having a spear in the chest, because it's what a natural part of CEOs do.
But should the business schools change the way they teach students?
Yes. In the sense that, there is such a spectrum of different business schools, and we're currently working with a number. One of them is Shizenkan University in Tokyo. So they're set up to be a business school for the 22nd century, which is a sort of level of ambition I quite like. And we're working with people like ISC in Spain, Copenhagen Business School and so on, and trying to pull together a course which is like the MBA course for the future. But at the moment, it's still very often having to happen on the outsides of the business schools or in networks of them to give themselves strength in numbers. I think in every area of our societies and economies, and this is not going to be welcome to some older people in the audience, people can be retrained. People can decide to think differently and behave differently.
But what should the schools do? Should they throw away freedmen or what?
I think they should remove tenure in the sense that, no, faculty members strain every sinew to get tenure. And once they get it, they can swan around forever. That's a problem because that older body of professors in economics and so on, there's some great ones, but most of them suffer from what David Suzuki describes as a brain disease. Economics, as it was, is a brain disease. And we've got to get rid of these people. And if they can retrain, if they're willing, well, wonderful. But if they can't, we've sort of got to move up the younger folk really much faster.
What would you replace them with?
AI?
Okay.
No, I mean, it's got to be a combination of significantly younger people, people with practical experience of dealing. I mean, I find myself in this really ridiculous position now of being a visiting professor at 3 different universities. And I love it because I don't have to play the faculty politics. I can parachute in. I did one last week at Imperial College. I've done that for 25 years. And then I can parachute out the same day. And then some of the students come on and do projects with us or join the team or whatever. So I think younger people have to be brought in. I think people with practical experience of dealing with these sorts of problems or challenges or opportunities in business, in financial markets, and in government, and also activist groups. I think NGOs are an extraordinary reservoir of
So you
talent.
want a Greenpeace member in your board?
It's happened. And there have been Greenpeace people who started out, in working in campaigning and went into business or even went into politics or whatever. I think that's totally healthy, as long as they remember who they are right through the process. But I slightly jokingly said AI, and we talked a little earlier on about AI, and I don't think it's going to save us remotely, but I don't think we can do what we now need to do, including business education, without a really rapid evolution in AI.
Do you see AI as a green or a black swan?
Well, if Nassim Nicholas Taleb was here, he would say black swans include solutions. They're not, I've just simply sort of squeezed out this green bit. I think there'll be both, and I think that they will cause, AI systems are already causing problems because they won't recognize black faces or whatever it is because all the people doing the coding are white young men or whatever. You know the stories. And that's very small beer. I mentioned the ozone layer problem. There was a satellite that flew over Antarctica every week, day after day or week after week, and Nimbus 7. And it looked down and it was blind to what was happening. Why was it blind? Because the coding in the satellite, or actually on the computers that processed the data that was streaming back, the coding was done in such a way that nothing like that was possible. So if the data came in showing there was a problem, dump it, because that couldn't be reality. And I think with the AI, we'll very often do the same things. We'll build in our blind spots, we'll build in our assumptions and prejudices, and that's why I think AI has got to open up and be challenged. And so bringing NGOs and others onto the boards of DeepMind or some of the people who are doing this work now, I think it's got to be done sooner rather than later. And isn't it interesting that Microsoft, I think, disbanded their ethics team?
Yeah.
No, idiotic move.
All right. But before we all getting replaced by AI, I just want to touch a little bit more about the skills, the management skills, the leadership skills. What is required in the future? I read that you said somewhere that we have a narrow window of showing our responsibility to the world before we are run over by history.
I've recently been reading a book by Andreas Malm. Some people will know him. It's a book called How to Blow Up Pipelines. Part of that narrow window is I think we're going to see new forms of activism coming up where people decide enough already. We've tried lobbying, we've tried campaigns. The fossil fuels industry is just digging in deeper. It's investing in fossil fuel resources that will guarantee that we go to 3 to 4 to 5 degrees. Blow the buggers up. I mean, just go out and blow up their pipelines. I don't support that, but I think you're starting to see people wondering, if we can't get at them through democracy, how can we get at them? And I think that when I think about a narrow window of opportunity, I'm not just thinking about the science. I'm thinking about politically, we have young people around the world now who feel betrayed. Eco-anxiety is increasingly talked about. When I first heard that term 6 or 7 years ago, I thought, they're making it up. But it is not only a reality. Nature magazine, you probably know, but did a survey 18 months or so ago, and it was international, 10,000 young people. Where in the world are people feeling the greatest eco-anxiety? Philippines, Indonesia, Brazil.
Very close to the change.
And very close to the problems. And when you come to Europe, which European member state is showing greatest evidence? Portugal. Because more or less when the survey was done, the fires were blazing and so on. So I think we've got a very narrow window in which to persuade younger people that democracy and capitalism and markets and business and so on have the will to solve this and have a good chance of solving it. Because otherwise I think things will start to unravel quite quickly.
But what we have described so far is that you see the optimistic perspective in how business develops, and there are new ideas, new technologies, and so on. But when I hear you talk about the political system like that, it seems like you think that part, at least, of the political system is broken.
Does anyone wonder in the audience disagree? I mean,
but what I'm thinking is, as I've been a reporter for years as well, I've followed the UN trail and visited COPs all around the world.
Well done.
There was a lot of waiting. And what frustrated me was that there was so little done. Because everybody had to agree, and it was very clear to me that the political system could not really make the progress and the change that was needed. It was too slow. So what have happened is that it is the consumers, it is the business that is actually driving the change. What happens then is that you will actually have the business leaders, the people with the money, the people with the ideas, that is driving this change. And maybe not the political system, maybe not the people who are elected through a democracy. Is that a problem?
Oh, it's a huge problem. I mean, there's so many different aspects of this, but I've only met Bill Gates once. He's a strange fellow, but he's obviously a very brilliant man. And I look at his almost super philanthropy into areas like controlling malaria, developing new generations of nuclear reactor and so on. And I think it's great that he's doing some of that work and some of these other extraordinarily wealthy multimillionaires and multi-billionaires and the rest of it. But they're not democratically elected. And I think it would be better to tax them and efficiently and effectively spend the tax money rather than allow these super concentrations of wealth.
But it's not only a matter of money, is it? It's also a matter of being able to make a decision and actually get something done. I think that's a huge problem around the political system, that even though you have the money, even though you have the ideas, you cannot have the majority of votes to actually get something done that you can get in the business.
Look, I can talk about what business can do constructively and positively and creatively, and I'm happy to do that. But if you look at what the billionaires are starting to do, they're buying up bunkers in New Zealand and Patagonia and so on. They can see the systemic consequences of what they've been doing.
They want their safe houses out somewhere.
They want a place to sort of retreat. But the question is, who's going to guard them when they're in those sort of bunkers and the rest of it? And that again is an example of people.
But what you're
seeing
saying is that you don't really trust them to do this.
Do you trust them?
If they actually live by the triple bottom line, but I guess that's what we're questioning, right? We're questioning that if the profit is actually still what drives the business.
I don't think any billionaire in the world has become a billionaire by doing what I would properly understand to be triple bottom line, market building, organizational development, all the rest of it. In fact, they've generally got there by doing something rather different. I mean, Microsoft, I mentioned. Look at their behavior with something like Netscape. As soon as a competitor comes up, you squash it dead. And it's a very, very brutal game that these people play. And over time, whatever they start out as being, they do change. And it's not that I dislike them. I've been sort of privileged enough to sort of meet quite a few of them and work with quite a few of them. And I think the younger generation of business leaders understand this now in a visceral way. And one of the things I've noticed very, very strikingly, and it happened in the 1990s, particularly in the United States, it's now happening again in Europe, where directors of major companies will say, my children are beating me up at the breakfast table about this. I'm going to have to do that, something about this. I know it. So there's that emotional charge.
Yeah, but what should we do to get them to act responsible? What is the parameter? Is it security?
Well, security, I think, is becoming an increasingly important factor. And if you think about the pandemic, COVID-19, if I've forgotten it already. But COVID-19 sort of came out of the blue. It wasn't a black swan. Even Taleb said that. He said, we saw it coming, we should have prepared, we didn't. Standard pattern. But that was a shock. And then came the Ukraine conflict and some of this sort of massive dislocation of energy markets and so on.
So after a couple of decades where we lived in freedom and...
La La Land. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think what we're now hearing is you listen to business leaders, you listen to politicians, and they're talking about security, by which they're also meaning water security. And you look at what's happening in Spain at the moment, these few weeks. They're talking about resilience, and you hear that all the time. How do you build resilience into individuals, into teams, into organizations, into economies and societies and so on? And that's not something we've actually grown up particularly knowing how to do. No. We're going to have to come up that learning curve very rapidly. And the best of leaders, whatever sector they're in, will work out how to do that and learn from each other very, very rapidly. And the business schools are lagging the curve on a lot of that stuff at the moment.
And of course, it's affecting the green agenda, but suddenly it's a totally different area to work in. We had 30 years of freedom and globalization. We were getting used to that the goods could just move around the world freely. And then suddenly we had the pandemic and we were missing that chip from China. And then suddenly we had the war and we couldn't get our energy. And it occurred to us that, maybe we couldn't just get this globalization working without there was going to be something that we were stopped in doing that in some way with the pandemic and now the war. And how does that shift the whole marketplace in which we are going to make a green agenda and a climate change?
Well, there are seismic shifts starting to happen in markets around energy and so on. And some of that is positive in the sense that investment in renewable energy and battery technology and smart grids and so on, and thinking about how do you link electric vehicles together as a distributed battery and all the rest of it. That stuff is being taken seriously in a way that very often it wasn't in the past. But the risk is that when people start to think about security, they think about the military, and they think about... in fact, I did a session with Britain's armed forces early last year, and it was sort of generals and it was admirals, and what they're thinking about now is climate change. But they're thinking about climate change because it's a real headache when you start to think about migration. And the numbers we're panicking about at the moment are tiny compared to what is coming. So, to your question earlier on about what business leaders can do practically to deal with this, one of the things, and COVID has got us into the habit of not going out very much. I mean, it's lovely to be in an audience and with people, but one of the things I try and tell to people, and not just CEOs, I mean, chief financial officers, other people at that C-suite level, board level, whatever, go and see some of the things that are already happening in this world where people are developing practical solutions. And there was a case some years ago now, but a group called Leaders Quest take groups of business leaders to strange places. And there was a German company, car company, automotive company, that asked to be taken in Silicon Valley to see an electric vehicle company. And they went. And the chairman of the German automotive company was extremely powerful man, cashmere coat, I mean, just used to being treated like the German foreign minister and all the rest of it.
Okay.
He visited the company and they said, "We don't understand why you're here." They said, "In 10 years we'll have driven you off the road. You won't exist." He then, the chairman then went to
And what happened?
well, he went to the restroom and he was overheard to say to somebody else, "Forgive the language, but fuck. I've been briefed on this, I've read about it, I've seen television programs. This is the first time viscerally I'm experiencing the nature of the market challenge that is coming up. We've got to scramble to catch up." Now, we've seen Munich, we've seen Detroit, all of these centers of the conventional, exquisite internal combustion engine engineering, starting to feel that this is sort of turning, and in very short order, into a very different sort of market. So I think get out more, go and see some of the people who are working on some of this new, including AI. Go and talk to some of the people who are working on AI. When I've done that, I find it shocking in a way. I mean, I really like them. I find it fascinating what they're doing. But they're like a different species. Their brains work 5 or 6 times faster than mine does. And they're very seized with developing solutions in this sustainability space. Tackling climate change is their future as well. But dealing with them is very different from dealing with the traditional business people.
But just if we just talk a bit more about the changes that happens in the world. You talk about go out and see how they work in different places, other parts of the world and so on. Do you think that the changes we see at the moment, which is not just a regional conflict in Ukraine, but it's actually shifting the whole world order?
Yeah.
And the Great South is really, really chipping in empowering. Do you see a shift in how the green agenda will work in this new world order, where you also have China as a huge player?
Yeah. Well, I've worked in China, and very few countries frighten me as much as China, in the sense that it's a fascinating country. I love being there, but the level of nationalism is off the scale greater than even Japan, where again I've worked a fair amount over the years. So when I look at Ukraine, I see the Spanish Civil War. I think there's a much bigger conflict potentially coming. Henry Kissinger has just gone public with his advice on how we can avoid a third world war. But there is a pattern to these things. And in the same way, you mentioned the geopolitical order, it's absolutely inevitable that will change, that the sort of post-Second World War order that we've grown up with the World Bank and the UN and so on, that's now being challenged, and over time, it's not at all guaranteed that will continue. And I see this as almost like a U-bend moment where an old order starts to come apart at an accelerating rate. And that is inevitable firstly, but it's necessary because until the old order starts to wobble, you can't get the new ones coming through fast enough and powerfully enough. So oddly, I find that makes me optimistic, what I just said. Although, we've been very lucky not having a really major war for a very long time. But that in itself is dangerous.
But can it change, can it drive humanity forward that we have this change in the world order? And I'm asking the optimist.
Yes.
Thank God.
But one of the things that struck me in working with China is how they're very acutely aware of certain environmental issues. So if you go to the eastern seaboard cities, air quality, major problems, schools being shut down because, the Olympics, I was there during the Olympic period, and you could only see these oxyacetylene burners around the bird's nest building through the smog, just these tiny distant bright sparks. So there are certain issues that they're really concerned about. And now they're in danger of really losing face because they're the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. I think what they're doing around renewable energy, around electric vehicles, is both exciting in a climate frame because they're coming up with solutions very fast, and terrifying in terms of the wider global economy because their capacity to just jump, leapfrog in these technologies
Why is it terrifying? Why is it so terrifying?
Well, if you believe that we can catch up and that a competitive threat like that really sparks, in the same way that the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is now sparking European sort of counter reactions, then that's not so terrifying. But I like individual Chinese, but the idea of a world dominated by China, I don't find that a terribly attractive proposition. Not that I find the US, infinitely amusing or reassuring, but at least they have this sense of a somewhat democratic world order.
But what will probably happen is that we won't have a bipolar world order as we're used to. We'll probably have a multipolar.
For a while. And then I think it will consolidate and converge again on something, 2 or 3 core concentrations of power. But to your question, I think the green agenda has the potential to become an immensely influential force, even in that very disturbed environment. Actually, in some ways, particularly in that disturbed. Because it talks of, it's funny because when I first became an environmentalist, for 20 years, my parents didn't understand what had happened to me, and even the people who educated me.
Were they worried, or?
They thought I should have become a merchant banker or gone into the Air Force or something grown up. I think they were worried. They thought, how could you possibly make a living out of all of that? But there was a tendency then in business to say, anyone who is green, it's the watermelon. They're really communists. They've been quite well camouflaged.
Very red inside.
Yeah. So, but also people would say, the green stuff, it's basically a religion. People are responding to this in the same way that they would a cult. I've always felt around the sustainability agenda, there is something very much like the architecture of a religion. And there's something about the human brain which likes religious structures. We have different ones and they compete, but even communism was a religion. And we keep defaulting to that sort of form of world order. And it's partly about something bigger than us, so the Earth. It's things that go on, it's afterlives, but it's afterlives of other human beings, other species. There's a code of behavior that comes with it. There's a sense of order that could come with it. And so I think you may find, I was once in China and talking to their environment minister, and he kidnapped me and a colleague, and literally kidnapped me, and took me off into a little resort, and we just squeezed me, poor man, for everything that I could say. And one of the things we talked about was the prospect of the ecological crisis spurring a spiritual and religious response. And he was absolutely fascinated by that, because in China they've seen these moments where things just go berserk and these vast social movements start. So I think the green agenda could be very powerful in that, but there's one condition, and that is that green politicians and people who embrace that change agenda, whether it's in business or the financial markets or whatever, they get out there and talk to the people who are creating the new economy now. And when I've gone to see people working on AI or synthetic biology or whatever, and I ask them, who else are you talking about to from the sustainability world? They'll reply, we're not. Because we're looking backwards. We're looking at fossil fuels and chemicals and automotive and construction and aerospace. We're not looking at what's basically the operating code of the new, and there may well be people in the room who are doing that. I'm desperate to hear from them.
Okay, well, yeah. So you actually think that this uncertainty of times can maybe drive forward that new thinking that we talked about in the beginning, where the social or the cultural aspect will be essential for the driver of the next change?
I think without culture change, this isn't going to happen in the time that we need and cost efficiently and all the other stuff that we need to happen. Culture changes, though, as you know, are very peculiar. You can talk about them, and Mao tried to do it, and he ended up killing 70 million Chinese people. But, well, I mean, we now do the numbers, and we see that was the reality at the time. You know, I came from a generation where many of them waved the little red book and believed in all of that. These sort of social excursions, these moments where people become incredibly excited or incredibly frightened by something, can trigger perverse movements. And I think one of the reasons I'd like to see the sustainability agenda, the green movements and so on, being more powerful and more effective is it's almost like a vaccination against some of that sort of stuff. It's a sense of belief that this corner can be turned. And and maybe I'm delusional, but I genuinely believe that we're very close in to sorting it out, or we don't.
Let's finish off by talking a little bit about the future.
That.
Because you wrote a book about swans, and now I know you're writing a book about sharks.
Yes.
What is that about? What should we expect?
Well, this is a book that sort of jumped up on me in a way. It was something that I felt I had to write, and it's sort of, as I travel around the world, I'm often asked, why are you doing this? What started you off? You know, it's almost the origin story. You're such a mutant. Something strange must have happened. So I thought, well, I'll tell elements of the life story, and I've been 50 years professionally involved in this field now. And when I started, it was the environmental wave, then there was a green wave, and then there was a sustainability wave, and then what I call the Greta wave, where sort of younger people became much more energized. And now it's fragmenting a bit. It's sort of impact and a lot of other things coming through at the same time, ESG and so on. And so I was starting to think, what is the characteristic of the work that I've done over decades? And a lot of it has been getting in very close to people who are very powerful, very influential, used to having their own way. In Europe, we talk about tickling trout. You get into the river and you sort of tickle them underneath. In America, in places like Florida, they talk about tickling catfish. The problem with tickling catfish is the catfish live in holes quite often, and there are things called moccasin snakes in there, so it's a very deadly game. But I thought, well, a lot of what I've done is like pickling powerful people. It's getting close enough in to distract them, to make them think in a different way. And there was one sort of, really, for me, one of the defining moments in my professional life was 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. Walmart, very powerful supermarket chain, decided that they would put pressure on their supply chain to clean up and deal with energy efficiency. Within 4 or 5 months, I had invitations to do sessions with the board of DuPont, big chemical company, and 3M. And the 3M exercise was in Minnesota, so I traveled all that way. I did the board meeting, and right at the end of the board meeting, a woman came up to me, and she was one of the board directors, and she had originally been trained as a psychologist. And she said, "Why do you use humor in a situation like this?" And I can't tell jokes, I can't remember them. So it's all situational, it's all in the moment. You're playing off something that somebody is saying. And she said, "I think it works." And she thought it worked for 2 reasons. The first was, I wasn't being a missionary. I was signaling that I could play with my own agenda. But then the shock was, I was playing with them in a situation, in an environment where people didn't play with them. And so she said the reptilian part of their brain will be thinking, if he's able to do that, the size of his army must be enormous. And to some degree, I think it's true that you can use a business case, you can use logic, but sometimes you just have to come at people in a slightly different angle.
Brain in from a different angle. Yeah.
Wow.
Just as a final question.
Yes, this is the deadly one. I said.
This is no, I'm nice, so you can be calm. I just wanted to ask you if you should recommend the audience to read something. I know you have 20 books; they can start out there. But I heard somewhere that if you should recommend books, you often recommend sci-fi.
I do.
Why is that?
I think science fiction is really intelligent people trying to think around corners, trying to think, what if? So there's a book called The Water Knife, which is about what happens in the United States when what's happened to the Colorado River, which it doesn't reach the sea. When I went down it 30 years ago, even then it didn't reach the sea. Mississippi is headed in the same direction. What happens when the US is starved of water? One thing that happens is you get water wars. Suddenly, Texans are treated like Mexicans are today. You read a scenario like that, it's a fictional story, you think, oh, hadn't thought of it that way, but it's a fully realized version of a potential future. Kim Stanley Robinson is somebody, the Ministry of the Future, I can never remember if it's of or for, but brilliant book, a bit like a novelized MBA dissertation in some ways, but partway through the book, which is about the species solving the climate problem, there's a very short section where he talks about black ops, where assassins start to go out and kill fossil fuel company CEOs. And then it very quickly slides away from that. But again, I think one of the things that we're being seduced into believing at the moment, and the Andreas Malm book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, I would be one of the things I would recommend. Very short, very readable, pretty bracing if you think that you can work with business and change them. But he's basically saying we've been lulled into the belief that non-violence will deliver the results that we want. And we're told that slavery was ended because people were non-violent. Actually, the slave rebellions in the Caribbean is what terrified slave owners. Suffragettes, only when the women walked down Downing Street and started throwing bricks through windows did people pay attention. Martin Luther King, if there hadn't been Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, JFK would not have signed off on that legislation. So I think we need to read round the edges of our subject. If there was one final book which I wish people could absorb, but I don't recommend reading it, was a book that I read when I was 14 in 1963, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. It's the first time anyone talked about paradigm shifts. And in that book, and I often go back and reread it because I can't believe what I remember having read there. And his notion is that a paradigm shift, a proper one, and we're going through one, and Lovelock's science is very much part of it. The Anthropocene moment is part of it. It takes 70 to 80 years to come through because you need to the people infected with the old paradigm to die, or at least retire, the people they taught to retire or die. But then he said something which is what I keep going back to and trying to remember whether it could possibly be true. I won't go through the full story, but just that when paradigms do shift, the people trapped in the old paradigm become almost nauseated by this new logic, this new reality that's coming up. And I think we're very close into that starting to happen. And what we've now got to do is very actively manage older people, including, I'm a baby boomer. Older people are going to be one of our biggest headaches because they become more conservative. They become, and in their pension policies, they want to go into safe businesses and investments. They're not going to invest in, the startups that are going to really change the world. We're going to have to seduce those people into supporting younger people, and not just their family members, but putting their wealth and their influence and their voting behavior behind disruptive change. That's going to be an interesting challenge for the next 10 to 15 years.
Sure. Well, I think that if we should get some inspiration to how to see green swans in the air, we will all read some more science fiction. That's a lovely recommendation. John Elkington, thank you so much for all your insights. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for the audience for listening. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.